thank you everybody for being here for what's essentially the first of our RIMS Futures presentations. I will talk a little bit more at the end of the presentation around the purpose of RIMS Futures and how we've gotten here. But first to, I guess, get us in the right mindset for looking forward to looking at how we're going to be creative in the response to the challenges that we are currently facing in our environment. I'm going to hand over to Gustav Rohde for his presentation. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with Dr. Rohde, he's a graduate from Stellenbosch University. In his career, he's been an active scholar, a practicing engineer, a businessman, and over the last 20 years, he was the CEO of Aurecon, Chief Operating Officer of Aurecon globally, and he is currently the CEO of African consulting firm Zatari. He currently serves on a number of advisory boards of the engineering faculty at Stellenbosch University. And he has a passion for the digital transformation of the industry and the role of engineers in broader society. So over to you, Gustav.
All right, Erin, thanks. Let me share my screen. Maybe you must just tell me when that's visible.
You're up and running.
All right, okay. Guys, so when Gordon Hart invited me to do the presentation, he said that he like myself, is frustrated that we in the road asset management fraternity, we've gone a long way over the last 40 years, but it seems that we might be in a point where we stagnate and we're not aggressively looking at future challenges. So I've taken a presentation that I've given 2 years, or year and a half back in Boston at a conference, and I've changed it slightly to really focus on a few things that I think is critical for, and I want to talk about future challenges and opportunities in the space of road asset management. Sorry guys, I see this thing is, there you go. All right, so I'd like to start off with this slide, which is, there's in North Africa, there's a proverb that says, if the rhythm of the drumbeat changes, the dance steps must adjust. And the reality is, I think there's a lot of changes going on in terms of digital transformation, the fourth industrial revolution, and things like that. And I think for us in asset management, we've got to embrace these things, because if we don't, we won't enjoy the dance, because we won't be listening to the beat of the drums. So maybe as a start, I'd like to just reflect on it to say that we're living in a time of drastic change. Or most people term it the fourth industrial revolution. And interesting enough, that was only termed back in 2016. So it's a relatively new concept, but the reality is all of these things, whether it's robotics, augmented reality, big data, cloud computing, machine learning, artificial intelligence, all of these things has really come together only recently. And these rapid changes has happened because of increased connectivity in the world, the fact that we're all connected, the fact that there's huge processing power in machines, etc., technology like visualization, etc. So all of these things are really influencing all aspects of engineering. And in my own career, the first half of it was in asset management, and then the last 15 years I was purely in management, and we put a lot of effort into getting my former company Aurecon ready for the digital revolution and all the digital changes. And when I came back into industry last year, I realized that our fraternity, the roading asset management world, I think we've done great over the last 50 years, but I'm not sure we're really capitalizing on the new opportunities. So just a quick reflection on road management. We could probably at the moment talk about it's probably about 50 years in the making. My first introduction was in the early 80s on paver, which was done by the US Corps of Engineers. And in those days, it was prior to microcomputers. So it was very much about analyzing or collecting distress information, putting it into an index, and then looking at optimization by just looking at what's the impact on the agency, typically minimizing cost. In the 80s and 2000s, things started changing where we started also doing predictions of individual distresses. And I remember coming over to Transit New Zealand when they started the current journey, where they started saying, well, let's predict performance, optimize for total transport cost. And really what I've got in the yellow box there is to say that the decision process started by saying it's not only about how does it affect agency, but also how does it affect the user, i.e. bringing in things like total transport cost, which was something that was driven by the World Bank. And then if we look at last 20 years, we started, obviously the technology started improving. We started thinking about multi-dimensional optimization, not only looking at cost, but also condition and impact on the environment, etc. And it's really about the impact of an agency, the road user, but also society as a broad, in a broader context. So what we've seen in our fraternities, there's been rapid progression. But I'm also worried that at the moment, there's a number of things that I think we really need to think about the future. And I've listed 7 that I quickly like to discuss tonight or this morning. The first one is that I do sense that there's a changing expectation by our users and by society. I'll say a bit more about each one of these topics. The second one is worldwide, there's an increased focus on sustainability, i.e. we realize that we've got to think about the environment in our decision processes. When I started being involved in asset management, we used the terms network and project level, i.e. network level, broad decisions, and then once you go into project level, more detailed stuff. And I think with the technology of the future and today, that gap is closing, where we collect enough information that we can actually probably get to project level quicker. I see a future where there's much more use of machine learning and data analytics. In society, and especially in public sector, there's an increased accountability expected from asset managers. The 6 areas that I see the challenge of BIM and infrastructure management. And the last one is just the big data, which might be great, but it's also a challenge that, and I'd like to just talk about the law of diminishing returns. So the first one is that we're living in a world where society is in the last few years become absolutely close to everything. I mean, if I wake up in the morning, the first thing is I take my phone and I can see how long will it take me to travel to Johannesburg. Immediately I know about community unrest in the country. I know about what Donald Trump did last night, and I know all of these things. Now, we used to be in asset management. On this left, you can see that an asset manager typically collected distress information, pushed it through the system, made decisions, and then started the process of rehabilitation or maintenance activities. We all said, yeah, we're keeping in mind the user, but the reality is there was little true interaction with users. I think we've got to realize that the future is going to be different, that there's going to be a lot of interaction because users expect information. They'd like to know what's happening, where, what, when, and why, and how their money is being spent. Right at the bottom, I've got a mobile phone. I think the future is about the public. You don't need inspectors to go out onto roads because every citizen has got a mobile phone that can pick up a photograph of a pothole and can also send that in with coordinates. So the interaction between users and asset managers is going to really, really change. If we also start to look at a different angle, is that everybody talks about smart cities, smart infrastructure, etc. The reality is that infrastructure is only smart if users experience it as smart. It's not about being, there's Internet of Things that monitor behavior of infrastructure or the fact that you can order an Uber or whatever. a smart city is one that people can experience it as smart. And if we start thinking about the assets that we manage as roading infrastructure managers, I think these things of data analytics, performance prediction, sensors, tracking, sound, light, face recognition, all these things has got to start interacting with our service. So quite on the one side a challenge, because I think we're going to be asked for it. The second part is what an opportunity to engage with the public and lift our game, because we can also use the public to support our challenges. The second big change that I do foresee is that the whole world, there's going to be an increased focus on sustainability. I've got a few pictures here. This is the city of Cape Town that nearly ran out of water just 18 months back. This is a photograph of Venice and just big tidal floods. This is Australia, I think in New South Wales, just big fires and things like that. This is a picture of a storm in the Middle East, of a river that's never had water before. And this is some dams that's running dry. So the whole world is starting to realize that we really stuffed up the earth. And I think there's a big challenge on us to now make sure that we become responsible in terms of our duty to be think sustainability. So what does that have to do with roading infrastructure? In the past, we had in our management systems, we looked at how can we minimize costs, life cycle costs. We also had optimization schemes that looked at how can we maximize condition. The one that I think is the future is also to start saying there's a third dimension, which is to minimize energy. And I'll try to explain that. So I see a shift from looking at the agency focus or the users to what's impacting society and also by implication the environment. So this is a graph that some work that was done in the States on the I-90, and what they did is they just analyzed and say, well, if we've got to repair 7.6 miles, we can either do it in one shot or we can do two construction closures of 3.8 miles or 4 times 1.9. And one can see at the bottom big differences in the energy being wasted, i.e. additional fuel, etc. So our decisions has got a direct impact on how much energy is being spent. On the right here, one can see typical infrastructure. This is work by Penn State. And one can see that you can see the axis there is contribution in greenhouse gases. So it's greenhouse gas emissions. And one can see this is a typical road and the components of end of life, construction, the materials we select, the maintenance activities that we do, and then also just regular traffic use. Now, what's interesting is most of these things is really only related to 3 distress types, i.e. roughness, because roughness directly is correlated with vehicle operating costs. Texture, because texture can be related to rolling resistance. And then deflection, because the more pavement deflects, the more energy is actually going or consumed in the suspension system. The reality is, if we think about it, we might be in a position where in the future we put more emphasis on these key measures because they impact the user and they impact society and user costs. And still many pavement management systems is working with many distress types. And one's got to ask you, wasn't that the heritage of looking at a serious engineering angle and distress times rather than starting to realize that it's about impact on the environment and users? We've also got to realize that the choice of maintenance and rehabilitation that you do have significant impact on the environment, whether you use an emulsion or asphalt or whatever. Every one of them has got a different carbon footprint. And we've got the opportunity to take that into account. We're doing it to some degree, but the reality is it should be much more important in our decision process. one of the interesting ones that I think is coming forward is that if we really care about the environment, I think there's a probable future where we got to go and say that let's consider only fix what is broken. I'm coming from a world in the past where we said that if you're working on half a kilometer segments and you come to a rehabilitation decision, you get to a point of saying, well, we repair the full half a kilometer. But the impact on the environment is significant. If you only could replace a third of it or a quarter of it, that might be the responsible thing to do. So as we have an increased focus on sustainability, our whole methodology and user experience might change. And there's probably a lot of work to make sure that the public understands why we change the way we do things. I've got this one, just a side note, that especially in the Northern Hemisphere, in Europe, there's big issues around what they call the circular economy, which is about, if we care about the environment and our planet, it is about reuse of things. And this is just a reminder that many things in our roading fraternity, it's sad that we waste such a lot. A lot of it can be rehabilitated or reused, etc. The third element I'd like to lift out is closing the gap between network and project level. What I've got there is the thinking of road asset management probably 20, 30 years back, where we said we've got to collect network information. And in those days, it was expensive to collect data. It was expensive to store and manage data. And we didn't have locational referencing methods of today. So typically you collect information on half a mile segments or half a kilometer or 100-meter segments, etc. These days we can get it by coordinate. In those days, it was heavily dependent on visual data collection, which was expensive. So I think the whole thing has changed, that today we can also rethink this, because we've got GPS and accurate location referencing techniques. Data storage is probably not constrained as it was in the past. And we have the great advantage that we've got repeatable, continuous, automated distress measurements. And the best example is just the measurement of road roughness or rutting, or these days visual information through cameras that can be used through artificial intelligence or something to tell us what the stress types are. And because this is continuous, it also allows us ultimately to get to this point where we can get optimal decisions. And again, only fix what's broken. You don't have to fix the full half a kilometer element, etc., which is probably the engineering solution, but maybe not necessarily the optimal choice. We are also, I think, we're in an exciting time where there's going to be increased use of machine learning and data analytics. And just by example, I'd like to share that the rate of deterioration is a much better indicator than the distress. And to just try and explain why I say that is, that yellow dot there might be the road roughness that you've measured. And then you can go into certain prediction models and trigger some distress types. But the reality is, if it was possible to look at the previous 3 years, at the bottom, you can see that there was no deterioration. This road didn't change in roughness for 3 years running. And that is actually a much better indicator than the roughness measurement itself. We've been collecting road roughness for the last 20, 30 years. And I must admit that I think as a fraternity, some of it are using more than 1 year, but the reality is, if we've got accurate measurements, well referenced, that we know exactly where it was taken, and we've got repeatable, continuous measurements, I think what an opportunity to do better. There's great opportunities with artificial intelligence and big data. The reality is, in pavement management, we've been collecting data in many agencies for at least 30, 40 years. Sadly, in most places, most of that is just collected, decisions are being done, and then the data is dumped. But we've collected all that stuff. So sadly, probably the issue is that the referencing wasn't done well, and most of our assessments are not repeatable enough. but what a wealth of information it should have been for us now to intelligently analyze it, to understand deterioration, and to understand the impact of treatments, i.e. and I think the future will help us to do much better in this, because collection techniques has improved, and at the same time, machine learning and data analytics, there's a lot of fantastic developments in that space. Aaron, this one I didn't have time to do some more information on it, but worldwide we're seeing that there's an increased accountability expectation on public officials. And what I mean by that is that as public officials, those looking after our road assets are responsible. They're spending huge amounts of money. And I think we still get away with probably we're not held accountable enough for the impact of it. And I do think I'm coming from the private sector. If you're today on a board, there's lots of assurance being done where shareholders demand to know what's the return on the investment. They will keep a CEO accountable for any decisions and see what's the impact. I think the future this will also start happening for asset managers, to say that if you've been allocated a few $100 million to spend on maintenance, what did you do with it? Was it spent optimally? And I think that's good for us because it will also lift the game. I think New Zealand is, from everything I see, is probably world leaders in this, where society is really keeping the asset managers accountable. But I think there's an increasing awareness that we're spending big money. And I do think worldwide, there's many places where officials are not held accountable for the financial decisions that they've taken. Number 6, in the fourth industrial revolution, especially in engineering, everybody talks about the digital twin. And what the digital twin is, it's a digital replica of a physical object, asset, or system. So examples I've got here on the top right, you can see the human body. They can build a model for every one of us where our vital systems are collected, where every x-ray that we've ever had is dumped, etc. So there's a model for a real person. On the left, you can see a truck. So these days here in the heart of Africa, a dozer would be running and it's monitored out of the States. The temperature of the oil, every part of it is being modeled. The bottom left is more in the industrial engineering side where it's a system. The bottom right is probably in our civil engineering space where we're starting to model cities with a digital twin. When I reflected on this, I realized that for us in road asset management, this is not something new. We've had digital twins for the last 30 years. It's not maybe because the reality is all of our systems had a relational database. We collected information. There was decision models in it. It could predict what's happening on the network on every element. It could tell us what the maintenance plans were, etc. So digital twin is not something new for us. It's been around. I do think there's going to be a challenge for us as we move forward, because what's happening is the rest of the engineering fraternity is waking up to this. On the top right there, you can see this is a typical highway design being done in BIM, and one can see all the little elements, etc. So I do think in asset management, we're facing an era where there's going to be an increased expectation that a digital twin infrastructure should be in a BIM environment for a number of reasons. The first one is the whole issue around life cycle asset management is clearly the future. So when we do a design, we do it in BIM in 3, 4, 5 dimensions, and every little piece is collected. And it's easy to say, and everybody argues that that can now become the as-built drawings. It can go into the future to manage it, and we can put the construction history into it. We can look at the performance history and treatments, etc. So it's the base for it. There's also another reason, and that there's an increased request from to optimize across infrastructure types. To say it's not only about the road, it's also about the bridges. If you get into a city, it's about the integration of the assets in the city, which is the road, it's the stormwater system, it's the bridges, it's the lighting, all of these things. And BIM is the platform it'll be on. That's going to have specific challenges for us in road infrastructure management. The first one is location referencing. Because we deal at the moment with linear infrastructure, everything can be collected by distance and offset. I.e., we can say it's kilometer 22 and it's the left lane, or it's 15 meters left. And BIM is different because BIM is all about coordinates. So that's the first transition that will have to take place. The second one, which seems simple, but it's very complicated, is what is the appropriate accuracy level? Because for us, probably in road rehabilitation, plus minus 10 or 20 meters doesn't make a difference. For somebody that's done a BIM model for a building, 10 millimeters is an issue. All right, so the whole issue about accuracy level will be something that we have to face. The third element I've got there is what data to store, because we're coming from a world where we say that only store the data that will influence decisions. So one's got to ask yourself, if you've done a construction and you've got the grading modulus or the mod of a material, do you put all of that stuff in there? And to what level of detail do you save it? So I think there's a world, and a lot of people are working on BIM specifications, but we in asset management, there's going to be quite a transition. And I would like to suggest that if we don't catch up, that we will fall behind. This is the last one. I just put it on there because I'm always fascinated by the fact that people think more is better. And I think we've got to really realize it's not. Interesting enough, Tiens was also there at the conference in Canada. Typically, you'll ask some of the road managers, typical discussion would be how many distresses you've got. And I looked at one of them that's got 26 distress types that they've collected for 35 years. Every year on every element, they collect 26 distress types. And I would probably put some money on it that at the end of the day, a number of those has never influenced any decision. But they think it's great because it's collected. And I think the whole thing of big data, we're at a point now where we start to collect, especially with automated collection methods, we're collecting huge amount of information. That does not necessarily mean that it's a better decision. Like I see on the graph there. Challenge for us is to collect enough to make a good decision and not to be under the impression that more data means better management. All right, this is my last slide. Just a reminder again of this quote: say, if the rhythm of the drum beat changes, the dance steps must adjust. I grew up in the Western world, so I know about if you enjoy a dance and you do a two-step and the music changes to a waltz, you stop enjoying the music or the dance. And I think the reality is we are facing all these changes. I think it's fantastic. It's giving us the opportunity to do much better, but the reality is we can't stick with what we've done in the past. We've got to change our steps because the reality is the rhythm of the drum beat has changed. Last quote here is: do not say the land ahead does not exist simply because you cannot see it. Aaron, that's my presentation, and I hope that at least stimulate a bit of thoughts or discussion.
Thank you very much, Gustav. Gosh, a few different things there that I want to touch on. I think one of them's the piece you were talking about is that, you know, we're starting to see people bringing through those presentations, bringing that climate piece and showing those various different pieces of evidence that are happening around the world, that we're frankly not getting away with this anymore. It's really starting to catch up with us. And what do we as an industry do to frankly get us moving a damn sight faster in that space? and I think technology is going to have a huge part to play in that. And we know that you know, technology in other industries has been a huge disruptor. I saw somebody speaking the other day about the disruption that electric vehicles have had to that industry, that Apple had to the computer industry. And you know, we can see on the horizon that there's going to be these technology changes that are going to be huge disruptors in our world. The other thing about that accountability of asset managers, I think that's a really good point, because as somebody who's a non-technical engineer, well, I'm not an engineer, I'm a non-technical person. You know, some asset management's almost a little bit of a dark art. It's a bit of a hoodoo voodoo to people who don't actually understand the detail of it. So I think we need to think about how do we demystify it and present it in a way where it's understandable to those people, you know, at the top of organizations, so that they actually can measure and assess how we're going and whether we're making the right decisions. I know somebody who once said, if you come and ask me about how we're doing in asset management, I'll tell you we're doing a brilliant job, but you might like a second opinion on that. So how we actually start to give people that visibility. We're going to kick into questions, but I'm actually going to take the opportunity to ask a quick question first. And that's that for people around in our industry that are faced with this change, they're faced with the challenge of the task ahead. You know, what would you say to people as to how to respond to that? What do they need to do? How do they position themselves differently to start to influence change and be part of the solution rather than just being dragged along with what other people are doing?
Erin, I find it interesting that with the whole world of digital transformation, the one thing that I would encourage is that the next generation, and that's the younger professionals, are much more at ease with the digital tools, and they're much more at ease with change and taking on the changes. So one of the things that we've done in the last few years on digital transformation, and I think that's applicable to this area as well, is really use the young folk, use the young professionals, because for them, they like to bring innovation to it. They really understand the digital tools, and whether it's data analytics or machine learning, etc., or just BIM. I think for them, it's much easier to change that. So for seasoned professionals is bring the experience, but don't hamper the innovation and the new way of thinking. Allow that to come to the front. Obviously, I think the road asset owners should also stimulate that, because I think the innovation happens probably most easiest with the universities and with consultants, because they are there to, obviously the university brings innovation, naturally that's their space. But if you get consultants to also be involved in innovation and bring new ideas to the fore, I think, and reward them for it, I think that's a way to keep pushing the frontier.
And I think the other piece in that space too is that realization that if we're going to do things differently, if we're going to change different things, we're going to get it wrong sometimes as well, and that's okay too.
Be ready to fail, because otherwise and that's one of the shortfalls of an engineer is we don't want to fail. We've been taught that it's got to be 100% perfect before we do it.
Mm-hmm.
I think we've got room to explore and experiment and fail cheaply, fail quickly.
You need sort of thinking about failing, not as failing, just as learning. And it's a lesson.
Yeah, that's right. Adjust and adjust. Yeah, absolutely.
So any other questions? Tins, you've got a room of people there. Have you got any questions from the floor?
Exactly. Let's let those guys have it.
I have warned them we're going to do questions, but I'm going to take the queue and jump right to the front. Gustav, thank you very much for the talk. I've got a question for Gustav, but at the same time would raise this as a challenge to the RIMS group in in this wonderful initiative that you have embarked on. I've been involved with the World Bank in about 5 countries integrating climate adaptation into asset management. New Zealand has gone a long, long way in understanding the risk and the hazards on our infrastructure, but we don't put it into asset management yet. That's a challenge for the RIMS group. Gustav, the question to you is, what do you see is going to be the main developments around the way that we deal with data and with systems, bringing in these multiple considerations? Because a problem we have is collecting the data. The little bit that we have to do is already an issue. How are we going to deal with more data having to come in, and also the systems that's linearly focused at this stage that needs to look at everything else?
I think it's probably what, and it took a while for me to think about this because of my basic training is very much pavement engineering. So for me is I like to go into the detail, but the reality is I think we are at danger of collecting too much information. Like I said, there's agencies, and I'm not familiar exactly what's collected currently in New Zealand, but if we start collecting 20 distress types, I think the reality is we could probably reduce that significantly without affecting the accuracy of our decisions. I think it's easy to go back and say, well, analyze all the data you've got, look at the correlation between the decision and the data. And you'll find that we're collecting a lot of things like edge breaks and whatever else that doesn't influence the decision process. So one can limit the number of things that you collect. And then if you collect a few key distress types, I think focus on those that's absolutely repeatable. And you know that many of the distress types of the past were not repeatable. They were kind of coarse. I'd much rather use a few instruments and get good data that's repeatable, and then to use on a continuous way and use effectively. The world has also changed, that I don't think data storage these days is not that expensive, but it doesn't help we store data that's garbage. It's got to be quality stuff. It's got to be well referenced, and it's got to be repeatable. Otherwise, no machine can learn from it, because if you do machine learning on poor data, it will be totally unreliable models that you do. So I think, in short, if I have to start on a clean page, I will rethink about coming back from the decision process. What is the critical things that influence the decision? Only collect that and make sure that it's well referenced.
Thank you. I think there's also an element of, we see a trend in New Zealand where you get clustering of authorities, and they're starting to collect things and store things together, which brings huge efficiencies in the process. And it will be, particularly in the climate area, we're going to see more of that, where data is collected at a national level and then shared with everybody. So no, thank you for that answer. I'm going to just check on my class for questions. I'll be back now.
Thanks, Tens. I think that piece is really key around what information are we collecting that really influences the big picture outcome of the decision, rather than necessarily having to have that 100% accuracy that may not really influence the overall result. I know I was involved a while ago in a discussion around a water pipe, and we were sort of turning ourselves in knots for ages trying to figure out how we were going to get a pipe across a bridge, and it wouldn't work because we couldn't get the size across the bridge that we wanted. And finally, when we got down to it, we found out that it was the difference between 1 or 2 years at the end of life of the pipe that we'd spent, you know, a year trying to figure out how to get that solution, when really in the big picture it probably didn't really matter at the end of the day. So.
Because I mean, on that one is also, I mean, oftentimes we go for a position of say, well, let's collect a piece of information because we might need it, or it's nice to have. But as soon as we multiply that by 6,000 kilometers, it becomes an expensive exercise just for maybe we might use it.
Gustav, we've got a very good question, and particularly in the context of some of the developments that's happening in New Zealand. It is to do with the early adopters. So we're going to get 20% of our councils and our companies that embraces some of these new ways of doing things. How do we drag the slow adopters with us on this journey? And I know this is a topic area that you have done a lot of thinking about.
Yeah, I mean, the early adopters is fine, but I mean, that I'm thinking about a normal distribution, and you've got the early adopters, and then you've got the critical mass, and then you've got those that will never change. And the issue is to go from the early adopters to that critical mass when things start to flow, which is probably from that 20% to the 50%. I think I mean, a lot of things there that's important is, I mean, obviously the early adopters, the next thing is to share the success stories. I think very much it's about the road owners. They've got a lot of clout. I mean, the reality is they can force direction by being enthusiastic and by funding the right things and giving credibility to things that's on that journey of change. Because ultimately, I mean, all those that's doing road asset management, that's not in the public sector, that's consultants or contractors, is they there to please the client and the clients. So I think and I must say that at the moment is, if you look at road asset management, New Zealand is ahead of the world, and it's been because of early leaders 15, 20 years back that had the vision, and they took everybody on their journey. And I think now, even after the 15 or 20 years, you guys are still leading. I mean, Tian's joined me at a conference last 18 months back, and it's evident that countries with much more financial clout than New Zealand is lagging. So I think it's about having visionary leadership, and those early adopters are critical. And then it's just about pushing and celebrating successes and showing successes, because ultimately people like to be successful.
Absolutely. Tens, any other questions from your room?
I think we've burned out all the questions, and we're about to get to our break stage, but just want to say from the class, thank you, Gustav.
Welcome.
Yes, and I'll echo that. Thank you very much, Gustav, particularly for taking the time to present to us when I know you're on leave this week. So we greatly appreciate it. To everybody, the presentation today will be made available online. So if anybody's talking to you about the fact that they missed it, they will be able to find it. We'll send out a link to that. And just before we close up, I'm just going to run a bit of a quick video just on RIMS futures before we go. But Gustav, I will let you go before that. Thank you so much for presenting.
All right. Okay, guys. Good night. Bye-bye.
That was great, Gustav. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
And I will just move to sharing my screen, so bear with me. As infrastructure professionals, we know that we need to deliver for our industry and our communities in a big way. We need to do this in the face of legacy challenges like underinvestment and funding constraints. We need to do this in the face of an international skills shortage. We know that we need to adapt to what we've learned from a global pandemic, and boy, do we ever need to get moving on the transition to a low carbon way of life. In the face of these challenges, RIMS has been looking at what do we need to do differently. We know we need to be creative. We know we need to think outside of the box. We know that transformational change is something that's no longer a luxury for our industry. It's something that's now become mission critical for us. But for anybody who's ever been asked to be creative, anybody who's ever been asked to think outside of the box, we know that it's a lot easier said than done. We're all extremely busy with the demands of our daily lives, our careers. That doesn't leave us very much time to be creative. So at RIMS, we thought about what is it that makes us feel inspired? When do we feel motivated? When do we feel brave? And what is it that brings about that way of thinking? And off the back of that conversation, 2 of our senior transport engineers spoke up. And they spoke about how they'd attended an international conference together where the conference theme was futures. The organisers of that conference had gotten a whole host of thought leaders from around the world together to front that conference as keynote speakers. And after listening to the discussions, immersing themselves in the thoughts and ideas of those people, our 2 transport engineers felt like they'd landed on a new planet. Suddenly they felt like inventors, they felt inspired, they felt motivated to stimulate change, to challenge the thoughts and the ideas of people around them. And they felt challenged to do that because they'd just spent this time immersed in the thoughts and ideas of people who were already doing that. One of the speakers at that conference was a highly respected international transport engineer, Dr. Gustav Rohde, who spoke about the beat of the drum. The notion that change in our industry is akin to a drumbeat change, that when change happens, we need to adapt, and we need to adapt fast. And if we don't do that, then we'll be left behind the beat of the drum. We'll be caught out of step. And it was off the back of that conversation that RIMS Futures was born. The idea of a TED Talk-like international speakers series to stimulate change within our industry. The ability to bring international speakers in short snippets of time and present them live to our industry, to have questions and answers, to get people thinking and stimulate that transformational change that we need in our industry. So what I'd say is that you are our industry. You are the people that need to do this. Nobody's able to do it for you. You need to be creative, you need to be brave, you need to think outside of the box. And to do that, you need to immerse yourself in the thoughts and ideas of people who are already doing that. This is the purpose of RIMS Futures, to challenge you, to immerse you in a futures way of thinking so that you're ready for each new beat of the drum. Thanks, guys.